Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to me tonight at the AWS User Group. It's a great privilege to speak to you all, and I hope you enjoy the talk with the ambitious title Voice Tech, Everything You Know Is Wrong. This is probably not your standard AWS User Group talk. All I really want to do is make you think about the voice industry from the position, and again, a privileged position of having done it for about 8 years in different guises, which I'll come to, and hopefully make you think differently about a few things and not overly technically about how voice works and what you might do with it as a developer or architect, designer, whatever it might be. It might be wise, given the subject matter, to mute any smart speakers in the vicinity of you listening to this. So just to give you a few seconds to do that, I will take a quick pause before we get on with the talk, because I may mention a few keywords here and there that trigger things to happen, and I don't want you to be having shopping baskets filled, music playing and such like. While you do that, just for a few seconds, I am here tonight speaking on behalf of Waracle, one of the UK's, or indeed the UK's leading web, mobile and emerging tech company. Proudly hailing from Scotland, but working all over the UK with many clients, as you see in the slide here, from the NHS to RBS to Sainsbury's Bank and many others. And whilst we're not here to sell anything tonight, we're clearly here to make ourselves known. And I hope you follow up and have a look at what we do elsewhere. We believe at Waracle that mobile is the imperative, and that's kind of the paradigm we work with for all project work. Mobile is the one thing that never goes away. Now it's established with users, companies, enterprises, and you have to think mobile from day one. So take everything in this presentation with that in mind, that voice really is a layer over and above mobile and other things that are now prevalent. So do please think about it that way and take everything I say with that in mind. For example, a survey carried out only last week said that 76% of people have used voice on their smartphone in the last week in the UK, whereas only about 60% of people who have smart speakers have used them in the previous week. So it just shows you the things that you might not know are actually true. And again, that's really the theme for this whole presentation. Myth number one, and I'm going to break this whole presentation down into a series of myths, which is things I think you may not be aware of. Whether you think everything you knew was wrong is up to you afterwards. But number one, voice just works, ship it. The number one rule I always tell people about designing for voice and developing for voice, having done it over the years in several companies, is that people tend to dive straight into code and think about the architecture of voice and how to develop. Many people think about architecture, such as the AWS standard architecture you see on the screen there, and work backwards from that to actually thinking what to do with it, without really getting to the outcomes, which are the really important bit for the user, which is always the case, but more so the inputs that get the users to them and giving enough thought to that. For many years, and I took part in this, working for Skyscanner, Amazon, BBC and others, taking part in meetups, workshops and elsewhere, people were taught to build skills and actions very quickly, because it can be done very quickly, but it can also be done very badly very quickly. And what actually happened was the industry ended up with 100,000 voice apps in various guises, giving you things like cat facts and, notably, farts, which were one of the main things people do on their smart speakers. The successful ones never thought that way. Some of the most highly rated experiences on all these platforms were made by people who never coded a day in their life, people who were UX experts, translators, linguists, and people from that line of work, people that designed call centers in the past and understood the paths of conversation. And once they hit on something that worked in the standard ways they designed their user experience, then they decided to make them more bomb-proof, technically, make them scalable and things like that. Because essentially, this industry is not new, and I'll come to that in a second. Many people who thought about voice for the last 20, 30 years potentially have come to this with that in mind, and don't think too much about how to build and what the technology offers and how to stack it. You really have to think about what works. And even if you test ideas to destruction on paper, or have two people conversing and taking notes of how the conversation goes and where it goes off in tangents and so on, so you can design how that works, that's the important bit. Everything you hear from now on will have this in mind, that you have to really think about how a conversation works. And then, and only then, you can start to think what else you can do with it and how to make it work technically. And that's really all because you could have been giving this presentation 5 years ago and it wouldn't have been an awful lot different. The voice industry tends to go in leaps and bounds, but they tend to have lulls in between. Bell Labs introduced Audrey in the 50s, which was really a way to dial numbers by voice. By the 1970s, you could add vowels and consonants, separate the words out, understand accents differently. It took to the 90s, and you might be as old as me and read out paragraphs and chapters of Alice in Wonderland to train Dragon Dictate. So you could type by voice on a Windows PC. The last 10 years, through cheaper, faster, more scalable technology, got that to 95%. But in presentations I and others gave in 2016-17, it said 95% then. I don't believe it's much better now. That last 5% is really hard to get to. And that's because of many environmental factors, mental factors, people's approach to voice. It's difficult to do, and that last 5% is not going to go away anytime soon, so you have to design against it. But people then say, when I challenge that sort of thing, and again, I'm trying to get to the point of everything you know is wrong and try to turn people's opinions around. Siri understands everything I ask for, people say. And whilst that's true for some, it's unlikely to be true for everyone, or even many people. When we speak to each other, we tend not to overthink what we're doing. We say what's in our head, we know what we mean, we know who we're speaking to and what for. Speaking to machines never has that context, so even phrases we understand from our lungs on the way out are not easily understood by a machine. For example, the BBC, when it designed its very original skill, had to start using BBC as 3 words as an alternative invocation, as it's known, to make sure when people said something, the machine could go one way or the other depending what it thinks it heard and still land on the right thing. In the US, where things like airport codes are frequently used in reference to travel, LAX, Los Angeles International, frequently comes through as the word LAX, assuming a southern state accent, and my accent was terrible, apologies. That's the problem with words. Getting the intent of the phrase, which the person said, which is the thing in our head, is even harder. How's my balance? Is that related to finance or health? I'm on a course tomorrow, education or golf. We saw her duck. Does she own a bird, or did she avoid a bad accident? I'm going 4 miles, 4 miles, form isles, islands. Could mean anything really, and the intent can only be found from a sentence until you understand what the words were and what they might mean. And then when you get to that, your user experience and research becomes designing to seek intent, not words. The phrases you expect people to say have to be not just trained, but also devised in the first place. You have to know what people might say to test that they do. And hopefully you always get it wrong, so you find something people did say and hope to cope with that later. And each of these phrases has to contain an intent, which effectively gives you a route from that phrase to execute the response for it, so you know exactly what was meant and how to deal with it. Even within that, you then have to get the entities of the phrase. So for things like, what direct debits come out tomorrow in a finance type skill, tomorrow being the entity that you have to use as a variable, effectively, to know the context of the phrase. On most platforms and in any voice service, be it a smart speaker, a telephone, a contact center, or anything like that, this is the critical work long before you start to build anything. Because often, when you actually get to the technical bit, you realise you don't get to hear what people said. You only get, in many cases, the intent that you have trained the person to hear. So if they were to say what direct debits come out tomorrow, you may get something along the lines of a function name saying direct debit intent, variable name tomorrow. And that's all you get to deal with and nothing else. All the other words are thrown away. You have to deal with that success rate with a limited knowledge of what's been said, so you have to add them slowly over time as you find the phrases that triggered the intent or didn't. It's hard, and it's not really coding work, which is my point originally. Myth number 2, smart speakers and well-known assistants, general assistants. It's all about Alexa, Google and Siri. When people think about voice, I'm willing to bet in this country and for most of the developed world, they think Alexa. For people on Android phones, they probably think, hey Google, and things like that. And hopefully I've not triggered many devices. For Apple, for the last 10 years roughly, it's been Siri. But underneath that, and I forgot to mute my own Alexa, do forgive me, there's one going off in the background. I'm skint. Should the assistant try to sell you a credit card? And I'll get to the depth of the explanation of this in a second. I'm hungry. Does that mean danger or takeaway? I'm unwell. Does it mean you'd actually need attention or paracetamol? Or are you just saying it in passing? I'm frightened. And that's even worse in the sort of context of the last few weeks in the UK. Should something happen because of that? Or should the assistant just ignore it and not take part in the conversation? Now, there's reasons I say these things. I'm not being flippant about it. If these phrases were actually understood and they came with context and they came with some attachment to a user, because on most devices you speak to, there's a way of identifying who you are. Who is it that answers the question? Is it the assistant, or is it something the assistant speaks to? Essentially calling on help behind the scenes. Should they even take part in that conversation? As I say, voice generally makes people think of what I call a general assistant. And Alexa, Google and Siri dominate the marketing, if not the market. But this causes some friction. A general assistant will never know everything, and they're not specialists on any particular subject necessarily. Now, it may be that within the realms of each of those, they have their own specialist subject that is part of their general knowledge. So, for example, Alexa will always know more about Amazon shopping than the other two might, or any other assistant in the market. But they are not designed as overall services to be a specialist in a single thing, because they still have to carry the knowledge of all the other things people might ask. They don't always have access to customer data that isn't theirs. So, despite Alexa, for example, having access potentially to your Amazon shopping account, it certainly shouldn't and by default wouldn't have access to your bank account. Regulation may well stop them doing those things in the first place. In the EU, it's actually not permitted in most cases for an outside assistant to access something like a finance system without a very strict regulation around how it's done. So any phrase you say about banking, even if you gave permission to access your account, that phrase is not allowed to be learned and used for something else. So if you did say, I'm skint, a platform should not be allowed to sell you a credit card as a byproduct of that, even if they were just innocently giving you your account balance. Therefore, we have voice apps, skills, actions, shortcuts, and such like, and therefore mediates things you say between the assistant and the underlying service. You can't be 100% sure of what was said in the first place, as I said, because the audio is almost never shared. The text rarely is in many platforms. You have to create secure access to data, which is another layer of friction. So if you do actually want to do something that's permitted in regulation, such as giving somebody an account balance with a very innocent phrase to get there, you have to enable permission to do that, which essentially leaves the voice app to authenticate and come back again, which isn't pleasant. In a voice service, it might be okay in an app or a web page, not in voice. And users then have to remember a service name or brand and the phrases that got them there. So if you did happen to say, I'm skint, and eventually you were led to your own bank through some mechanism, the next time, more than likely, you would have to remember which bank you have to ask for, and that bank may have its own assistant name, for example, in the future. So there are good reasons for that to happen, but I'm trying to demonstrate some of the friction that exists in doing some of this. But over the years, this has started to get better. There is a thing called interoperability in the voice architecture ecosystem, which opens up possibilities for a specific number of things to happen. For example, one thing that is on the way now, even in the smart speaker world and potentially on devices, maybe not Apple, but potentially all the other billion phones that people have, being present on a device where you can say your wake words, be it Alexa, Siri, so on, could be present on those devices and open up other brands to that system. So if you were, for example, Waracle, you could say, Waracle, what's happening today, for example, and that would be understood and route to a different assistant, not Alexa, Siri, and so on. So therefore, you can then have a very specific purpose assistant available on any device at that point, which then leads to things like having direct access to the audio, which gives you a much better chance of understanding what the person said and meant, going back to my previous point. And this is where it starts to get technically interesting because having that access opens up the use of many other systems and not the black boxes that some of these assistant platforms give you to use. You have brand attribution, and I'll come to an example in a second of that that's in reality. You can tell people to ask for you individually as a brand. That's not going to be as prevalent as domain names or even things that people find in app stores, because there's only so many brands people can remember that they recall, but it gives you the possibility to do it. And then you've got domain-specific capability off the back of that, training your phrases to be 99% understood, because you're not trying to understand, as an Alexa-style platform would do, any phrase that people might ever say. There's a limited set of things you might need to understand for a particular use case, and that's much easier to train. You get very specific context for those phrases, because there are only so many contexts those phrases will exist in. And effectively, what you then get to is a two-way channel, privately driven with your customers, and that's where voice starts to get really interesting. So when people think about voice initially to the start of the presentation and voice assistants, your mental model probably shifts to asking for the radio, asking for light bulbs and things like that. But if you unpick some of the more modern technology and what's possible, there's many more things you can do. UK has actually led the world in some of this space through the BBC, which I was privileged to be involved in. And like many things, the BBC has led the way because it can do things that other people may not be able to get into quickly. Beeb, the BBC's voice assistant, has been in beta for several months with the ability to scale to every household in the country using cloud technology behind the scenes. I'd better not say which cloud tech it is, but you can take a guess. Specialising specifically in the domain of BBC content and services. Now, the reason they do this is to get away from being mediated. The BBC wants to speak directly to its customers who pay the licence fee, and therefore it doesn't want a platform in the middle deciding when people say what's the news or something like that, who answers it, or having BBC News mediated in amongst other news which may or not be truth. So that's what the BBC aims to do. Technically, that rollout took about a year to enable, with 2,000 hours of speech recordings to get to an outbound specific Beeb synthetic voice. And alpha phase testing the phrases required, as I mentioned, partly on paper, partly with real people, and partly giving them things to say without telling them how to say it, which took about 3,000 users to get to some really basic functionality. A conversation as a service architecture, which sits on top of BBC current content. So you're effectively adding a conversational route to things that were already there. I'll come back to that point shortly. And creating a whole new brand identity. So Beeb, which is a reasonably well-known name for the BBC in this country, was a memorable and short thing for people to say to get to this assistant. And it had to meet some very tough public sector standards on privacy, storage, data protection, InfoSec, and these things that you would expect, which do come off the shelf from major platforms if you build into them, like Google, Siri, Alexa. If you're doing this yourself, the architecture gets a lot more interesting for the things you have to do to make that work successfully and safely. Myth number 3, privacy issues mean caution. And I didn't mean to overdo that with the pile of CCTV cameras in the stock image, but it's a big issue for many people. People always asked me when I was working on this stuff directly, aren't these devices always listening? And what they mean by that are the companies listening. The tech giants might tell you they are not, but common sense tells you if you speak in a room and a word triggers something to happen, of course a machine is listening at all times for something. But that doesn't mean it's always recording, and people tend to not overthink this as much as it's made out. And the media makes a big fuss every time there's an accident with a smart speaker or something happens. I've never seen one that wasn't explainable by something behind the scenes. Moreover, if you get over that, as many people do, because 30 million houses in this country have these devices one way or another, many people have smartphones that could be spoken to if they so chose. These interactions are suddenly ambient and happen whenever you need them to happen, and therefore they are natural. And that's where some of the logic comes from, trying to think about the inputs and outcomes of these things, because that's the bit that matters. And it's even more important because it's natural. People aren't always overthinking by opening an app, going to a web page, going to a machine, They are just saying what's in their head. So you have to really think much harder about how you address that input and outcome. The privacy angle may soon become less of an issue for people anyway, and I actually think it's not as big a problem as anybody makes out in the media. Modern devices and applications do much more processing locally than they did 5 years ago when smart speakers really came to prominence. For example, Google has started to about 2 years ago, do what's called federated machine learning. So the learning is done anonymously on device with enough information anonymously shared back to a pool in the middle that tells them what's happening with individual interactions. Now, it doesn't tell them whose interaction each one was, but there are ways to learn from people using as I say, federated processes and then cloud aggregation in the background, that you don't need individual recordings and people listening to them to be able to improve a service. So no data will be shared ultimately that doesn't need to be. And I don't think that'll be much of a problem over the years anyway. And once you get over that hurdle of not overthinking the privacy angle and think more about the natural behavior side of it, very few things create more delight in my working life experience than a well-made voice service. So the picture there is a workmate of mine from Skyscanner about 6 years ago who'd never seen a smart speaker in his life before, and I gave him a very quick task to do. It worked first time, and that was the instant reaction, unbeknown that the camera was taking pictures in the background. He's been happy for me to share that picture ever since, but it's proof that this stuff works when you do it well. And when people do actually just go to it with that natural urgency of something in their head and not think too much about the privacy and friction angle. Number 4, it's a new paradigm. Start from scratch. Now, I told you at the start that for Waracle and frankly for anybody who's interested in modern technology and user experience for consumers, mobile is the imperative, but that doesn't mean that the next thing beyond mobile is new and has to start from nothing. You need to think about voice, conversation, and these types of things as incremental, or you will soon get lost down a rabbit hole of trying to reverse engineer things you've built back into mobile and web and other services that people actually use, and think about augmentations rather than starting from scratch again. Voice and conversation done ideally, and I've seen this a number of times, should always be seen as an entry point to something that already exists. There are very, very few things, even in mobile these days, that are actually new as opposed to better. If you decide that a balance request in a bank, for example, is the thing you want to do, you shouldn't need to reinvent a wheel to enable that. There should be, if you've built your architecture well enough for other reasons, something you can expose to get to that outcome. You could think of an intent, for example, as a way to offer, through a conversational medium, a one-to-one mapping to the underlying function that delivers what people ask for. And that's a very simple thing to think about if you're into functional programming and simple exposure of microservices, for example. And that's one of the main reasons the majority of Alexa skills are tied to Lambda functions underneath. It's not just simple and enabled to do by the platform itself. It's a very simple way to think about getting from one piece of input to one piece of outcome, and a very nice, simple way to design a system. Think about things you've already got and don't try and make them any different. Don't invent new services for the purpose. Just make them accessible to this new technology. A friend of mine who now works for AWS, who used to be an evangelist for Alexa, constantly tells people voice is just HTML, and then underneath that you have services that render responses, and that's a very clean way to think about it, which confuses the life out of people when he says it, but it's absolutely true. If you think backwards, just to reinforce all this, mobile became that imperative because of mobile moments, meeting you at your point of need with the thing you needed. It's no more complicated than that. Immediacy and context combined to set some very big expectations 10, 12 years ago. The best mobile experiences have iterated from meeting those basic moments to deeper, broader experiences over time. Think about Uber, for example, which started out as a way to join up in the moment of need, empty taxis and people who needed to get somewhere. Now that same platform meets hungry people with takeaways. But it's deeper and broader, but the moments were never that much different. And the moments may differ, but the platform meets them having been built. That's a very good way to think about it. Conversational moments are necessarily different They are essentially complementary journeys to things that already exist, as I say, but what you can then do is take the notion of ambience, as mentioned, comfort and convenience. If you were watching football, for example, in a pub, maybe not at the moment and for another couple of months, but hopefully soon, you may be doing it in your house at the minute. You might ask your friend, your family, who's the referee? Has he done that before? In future, you could just shout at the TV. The TV is your assistant with the right amount of exposure of things that the TV channels show on screen and maybe only show fleetingly, so you've missed it. You should be able to ask some of the things that they offer the audience. Why distract yourself with another device, such as a phone, to do that? It's a natural thing to do, and it meets everything I've just said. You're essentially exposing something you do anyway in a much more comfortable way. Number 5, conversation won't replace apps. Now, this is controversial, having said mobile is the imperative, so I kind of put this out as a contrary point to that. If you think about it, we spend much of our time on mobile phones in conversations. Most of the top 10 apps by downloads are communication apps, and primarily within those, messaging. It's been said a few times that iMessage is the world's biggest conversation platform that nobody really knows about because they don't expose their numbers. And there's no download number attached to it, but it exists on 1 billion and a bit iPhones and iPads. An even higher percentage of time is spent in these apps compared to others. If you look at the 60 seconds of the internet that exists and add up the amount of time spent in services that really underpin a conversation of one kind or another, that's what we do on our phones, by and large. I mean, people do spend time watching video more than they did lately, but by and large, we do it as a conversational device. 2020 has seen a massive shift in us being willing to talk to screens, whether we wanted to or not. We're doing it now. Normally, I would hope to be standing on a stage in front of 200 or 300 people. Instead, I'm speaking to an audience of I don't know how many on a screen. Now, it's very good and it's great that we're able to do it. And those habits are forming quickly. And people will not change as much as you think after this pandemic passes. So even our behaviours have started to shift over time. Many parents will tell you having a smart speaker in the house is the difference between order and chaos with things like homeschooling. So there are habits that started to change that won't go away. And certainly the usage of conversational services has only gone up in the last few years. People already think in conversations when they use technology, and this is a little known thing, but I've been using this slide in one way or another, and I hope my friend Richard is listening because he devised this slide in the first place back in about 2014. People think in conversations. You just need to go to the annual Google statistics on the things people search for. They are searched in phrases. And they're searched in questions, which is essentially the start of a conversational exercise. Why were chainsaws invented? Why is TikTok being banned? And such like. Once you have these things, it's not hard to start to think about how to use them in an experience that runs across many channels and defend yourself against queries. Now, this is where I start to pivot from saying originally that conversation is hard to do. You need to get away from thinking about only smart speakers and need to get away from thinking about technology so much to now thinking about how if you've started out in the right process and think about what people actually want to say, then you've got many uses for that conversational design once you've done it. Which gets to the point, some people often say, and surveys have been done about this, it's been really hard in the last 5 or 6 years to persuade developers that voice and conversation is worth doing because they see the whole thing as a fad. They see it as not core technology. If you're delivering voice, it's not really standard apart from a few bits and pieces on Android and iOS. It's not really something you'd pick up through standard mobile SDKs, web development. And in some cases, people tell me it's too simple. It's really a bit of Node and a black box, but it just works. But if you go through this thought process that I'm trying to lay out, there is a lot to it that is worth the time. And it does end up in major scaling technology should you want it to. It's heavily reusable once you start to do this stuff. Many successful services start from the contact center, beginning with the most asked queries, doing some learning on that, and working backwards to which ones would benefit from the quicker answers. A well-known airline did it this way and took 330 million phrases in its call center and then live chat platform, and found people really only asked 7 distinct questions across all these conversations, which then became the basis of its messenger and voice apps. Skyscanner in our day started with beginnings in voice and messaging services, where we tried to design the right conversation to steer people through booking a flight, and then a simple price search based on many input routes. Ultimately, that became a contact center reusing much of the input and certainly all of the lessons we learned that we tried to reverse into what the airline example did by having the distinct questions we think people will ask, because we had that from our initial platform, and bolt it on to a contact center, which had at the time been essentially a telephony and human-based thing, and it didn't scale very well. So there are two routes into this that are equally interesting depending which side you come from. But they are essentially circular processes that are no more than agile delivery and constant learning from data you see. And no matter which route you come from, where you get to will be complementary depending which way you want to carry on. Service changed in 2020, but it was changing anyway. If you think about the right conversational strategy, scaled and automated, as I've described, you can do a lot with it. So if you think about being asynchronous, people, especially with all the things they've had to juggle this past year, which they will get used to, people juggle conversations all the time between different apps, between different people. But yet the conversational industry and service has tried to tie people to sessions which expire almost instantly for the last 10 years. That doesn't have to happen if you get the technology right. You can use, and I've said mobile is the imperative, this is where it starts to come in, you can use their ID for verification to save having to abuse voice channels or conversation channels looking for passwords or things like that. Just do it on the device they're using, potentially. Agents can handle 5 to 8 asynchronous conversations at a time, where they would handle one call or one session. So the whole thing scales in terms of input. Intent mapping and speech recognition can even give agents the most likely journey they want to get into and the right question to ask if they are handling a conversation. So it isn't just thinking about automation of bots and purely technological services. This actually helps people to do it right. And every person I've worked with in a contact center environment has said that if you can start to take away some of the easier questions with a bit of automation, you need to spend time with real people on the most difficult ones. And the easier you can make that for the agent and the customer, the better the service is. And then because of speech and emotion detection becoming more prevalent through the better adoption and use of this technology over time, you can get a picture of both what the customer thinks of a conversation, how the agent is handling the conversation, and even the whole breadth of a contact center at once to get the mood of the place. Do you need to send some people off on a break because it's got too angry because of a fault or something? You can start to overlay the same technology that's used for most of these voice services to that sort of aggregated environment. You can make service a lot more comfortable as well, and this is some of the lessons that you learn by doing a very simple voice service very well. Ask the right thing at the right time, and never think that people really want to be asked the same question more than once. Utilize previous answers. Use the knowledge you've got. Don't ask things twice. Don't make people type or think if they don't have to. Multimodal is king of certainly service input, but if the screen is available, you are better to use it and people respond to it. I remember at Skyscanner we had an example where offering people buttons made a conversation last 90% longer than it did before, because people didn't drop out at the point they were confused about what to say. And that's counterintuitive, but people are used to doing two things at once, as I say. Don't make people wait. Let them rejoin later. If you've got a delay in an answer to something, tell people. You'll notify them and let them reopen the conversation when they're ready to. And keep it simple. Don't force people to use long phrases, long sessions to get something that they already want to know. It's not worth it. Myth 7, it's all too new and hard to predict. Now, this bolts on everything I've said before, but we believe, and Waracle and I have been devising this for many years and still think it's true, it's almost programmatic to predict how a voice service at the point of design will end up, and we believe this stands up to any scrutiny. But there's a basic set of things that happen in a voice service and ways to measure the success of one, which will tell you through a formula if it's going to work or not. These things are instant value, V as I call it. Will a quick question and answer deliver what they wanted? Contexts. Will the service work across many contexts? Can it be spoken and typed successfully in those contexts? C1. F1, friction. Is the question hard to ask and so hard that you can't instantly recognise it? Do you need to get them to validate what they said, repeat what they said? C2, complexity. Does it have too many variables which get confused? So, for example, in the case of a travel search, which is one of the first things I tried to do, is it too hard to get the place names, the dates, the times, and things like that, and all the different options that might exist in a fairly simple phrase? It turns out the little bits inside the phrase are too complex. And frequency, given what I've said about ambience, natural interaction, and so on, is this thing likely that you're building to be used frequently enough to be worth doing? But it's all tied back to that fact of, is it something people can just do and ask for when they need to? And that's F2. Now, if you take all of those, and again, I would back this formula against any skeptics, you'd be surprised how easy it is to just apply some of these numbers using the 6 rules. And in the formula, so value times contexts over complexity times friction multiplied by frequency gives you, with a scale of 1 to 10, where the factor is should be high, you would like the denominator to be low, and you would like frequency to be high. That equals success with a maximum score of 1,000 based on 10 per unit. Now, if you were to take 3 examples of this, these are fairly simple ones, but hopefully they illustrate it. BBC Sounds is the most used voice service in the UK by a mile. That has been built by an outsider. I'm sure there are built-in things on the platforms that are used more often, but not much. So for people saying Radio 2, simple phrase, convenient. It works anywhere you can carry a smart speaker and be heard safely. You'll use it frequently. I think the last measure I saw was people change radio station 5 times a day on a smart speaker, which they wouldn't do on an old radio. And it has context because it works in many different things. I mean, you can ask for stations, blogs, podcasts, and so on. So it has many different variations that if it's in your head, most things are easy to ask for. Score, that still only gets 500 out of 1,000 in my estimation. Get me to sleep, which was one of the original developer experiences on Alexa and Google. Simple, because that's all you're really asking to do. It's a very neat function. It gives you ambient noise that helps you to sleep. Convenient, because it's bedside, it's voice driven, it's at the point of need. Frequent, it's potentially daily or more than daily. It's valuable because it helps your health. And yet still I give that 600 out of 1,000. And there's room to improve it. Now, take another one that I've actually worked on, and some people who are listening to this will have taken part with me. Get me a flight, which is never as simple as get me a flight. It's complex. It's open-ended depending on the variations of airline, place, time, and other filters you might want to do. It's infrequent. The research has shown people tend to book flights no more than 4 times a year on average. So it's not something you would necessarily come back to. And that's why travel companies tend to rely on web more than apps traditionally, because people just don't need the app to be there all the time. And it's slower. I mean, my estimation when starting to work on this particular thing was that 45 taps on a screen was worse than saying a phrase that was in your head. But 2 minutes later, getting back to, did you mean Berlin or Benin, actually gets quite frustrating. So on a score out of 1,000, being fair to the people who worked on this and put a lot of effort into it, the score of success is 1.5 out of 1,000 in my estimation for that particular example, which shows you how hard it is to get something right. But to reverse this back to the very early part of the presentation, that particular service was designed technology first and designed afterwards. And that kind of showed in the outcome for people who used it. And it's been torn to bits, sadly, in reviews ever since. So I think that's borne out by both user experience, behaviour, and the fact the service was closed down later on. Why should you embark on a voice service? Because of everything I said. I think, and I've always thought, it's the next imperative if it's done right and done to the sort of standards I've explained here. I hope that was very interesting. I'm here to stick around and answer some questions and listen in to the other presentations. It's been a pleasure to speak to you tonight, and thanks again for listening.